There may be no bigger display of the pink economy's power than Taiwan's Pride Parade. With visitors flocking to the streets of Taipei from all over the region, it's underlined the economic influence of the LGBTQ+ community. And with that, poured in the marketers and the corporate sponsors. But the shifting political winds in the US and the Trump administration's anti-DEI stance has blown over to this year's event in Taipei. Big corporations are quietly retreating from diversity initiatives and pulling their financial backing. So, after years of raising the pride flag in support of the rainbow economy, how much are corporate campaigns really contributing to the representation of the LGBTQ+ community? I'm Divya Gopalan, and you're watching Connected on Taiwan Plus. To get a clearer picture of the impact of corporate involvement in LGBTQ+ causes and activism, we're joined by Minwoo Jung, currently in Budapest. He's the assistant professor of sociology at Loyola University, Chicago. And in Taipei, we have Po-Han Lee, associate professor at the Global Health Program at National Taiwan University, whose research focuses on gender, sexuality, and disability communities. Great to have you both on the program. I'm going to start with Minwoo and just get you to set the scene here. Exactly what is the definition of the pink economy?
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for asking the question. So by pink economy, we mean by the economic activities and behaviors that includes LGBTQ customers and products as well. So it is the economic system that capitalizes on the rising consumption power of LGBTQ customers by selling and packaging certain products as LGBTQ specific or LGBTQ friendly or inclusive, right? So we can think of all those rainbow colored items or quote unquote Pride Month items that you can find in, those stores such as Target and all those services addressing the needs of increasing LGBTQ communities on issues of healthcare, insurance, and even relationships such as marriage and divorce. And this can also involve the increasingly popular BL or boys love or GL, girls love culture, as well as how the influencers and content creators in the attention economy, in the social media, capitalizes on the attention to these cultures as well.
Right. Okay. So you've set the scene there for what the pink economy is. Now, Po-Han, you, broadly speaking, let's talk about where the LGBTQ movement or DEI or inclusivity is heading, particularly after the Trump administration came into power and started laying down their directives and moving away from DEI. Are we feeling it? Why is that significant? And what is the knock-on effect, broadly speaking?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. But as far as we have been observing, the corporate DEI budgets have shrunk under political pressure, especially from the U.S. firms. So the result is fewer global sponsors, more dependence on private capitals. So uneven landscape where smaller local businesses and creative collectives try to fill the void, but it's very fragile new balance. So less foreign aid and more commercial health branding. Meanwhile, the U.S. retreat has reshaped the funding far beyond Pride events or other community organizations. For example, when U.S. aid and other U.S. development programs reduced or froze grants, many LGBTQ organizations or sexual health initiatives also lost crucial lifelines. So Asia-Pacific conferences, for example, on chemsex or on HIV prevention programs that was relying on U.S. aid and other pharmaceuticals in terms of the DEI projects now struggle to survive. So this kind of gap has been filled by European pharmaceutical sponsors trying to keep the events or the communities alive, however, reframing them more of a product or public health outreach rather than, something stripped away from activism agenda. So on the other hand, I mean, we can also see how this somehow depoliticized community activism in some countries, for example, in Thailand, or for example in Vietnam, in South Asian countries.
Right. So Minwoo, I mean, is it as a rule of thumb what the U.S. does, most of the rest of the world follows?
That's a great question. I think there has been definitely the pressure from the U.S. government on not just foreign governments around the world, but also foreign companies around the world, right? And then there has been cases that they accepted these, suggestions, invitations to follow. But at the same time, there has been resistances as well that we could find in some corporations, some businesses, especially as they do not rely heavily on the U.S. market, right? So I think it's important to think about the variety of the economic markets around the world and which depends on which, because it's not a solely U.S. dominant market.
So Pohan, this is where I bring you in. I understand you've studied the ecosystem in the UK, where corporations are using supply chain auditing to push for LGBTQ plus equality in other regions. Can you explain how that's somewhat filling the void?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because the alphabet soup of corporate equality looks American for many people, but actually in the UK, they use EDI rather than DEI. So EDI comes from its equality law since 2010. So it's very compliance oriented and rooted in their equality and anti-discrimination agenda. So which has been influential not only on academic institutions, but also corporates. So this kind of the EDI has its own root and historical context. Where on the other hand, we can also witness like similar agendas in other countries. For example, in New Zealand or in Australia, they use DEI-D with the first D implying decolonization in response to their indigenous rights activism. And then, so in the UK context, I think as long as the Equality Act still holds its power to make corporations to comply with the OECD or EU initiatives in terms of supply chain auditing or business and human rights initiatives, they will stay alive, and which haven't, so far I've been observing, which haven't been much influenced by the decay of DEI in the USA, in the United States.
Right. Oh, so Minwoo, we're talking about a different context here. You've lived in South Korea, the United States, and I understand you've also carried out field research in Singapore, where the pink economies have developed in very different ways under different environments and governments. Can you just give us a quick comparison of what it looks like in the different parts that you've particularly watched or looked at?
So a lot of these global corporations, let's say Fortune 500 companies, have developed their different approaches in how to best support their LGBTQ employees and also get in touch with their LGBTQ customer bases, right? Which are two different things, but oftentimes they collide with each other in different contexts. So oftentimes they use these three models approach, the Rome model, the embassy model, and the advocacy model. So the Rome model obviously is to follow the rules, especially under repressive context, right? So for example, being gay means being persecuted legally or even leading up to that penalty. And then you, as a corporation, are focusing mainly on protecting your employees not to get persecuted, right? Whereas the embassy model is a step forward, right? So as if an embassy functions in another territory, you get certain privileges, immunities from within the corporate territories, right? So you have certain levels of engagement within it, and that's where Singapore and other regional contexts can be part of. And then just to refer, the advocacy model is, again, one step forward that you can find in most of the Western liberal context or capitalist context that you can do. You can support outside efforts, outreach, philanthropic community engagement, etc. So when it comes to Singapore and other countries where politically repressive but economically highly liberal and global. They want to keep hosting these multinational corporations, headquarters, and foreign direct investment and foreign quote unquote talents. So they want to tolerate certain levels of LGBTQ presence and even politics. So they can even find not only LGBTQ employee equal policies when it comes to benefits programs, pensions, etc., but also it does allow certain level of political activities within the corporation. Sometimes it has the spillover effect onto the civil society so that they can donate, they can sponsor, the corporate LGBTQ employee groups can donate, sponsor, and collaborate with civil society groups and NGOs in Singapore. That's what I have observed in the past decade or so.
Right. And Taiwan has that advocacy model that you're speaking of. Is that right?
Obviously, it's more towards the advocacy model. It's a freer country, right? It's maybe one of the most democratic and free countries around the world at this point, given all the surges of illiberal regimes and authoritarianism. So that even outside of the corporation, people are free with the legalization of marriage equality and other inclusive legal and policy changes for different minoritized groups, including LGBTQ communities, right? So when it comes to advocacy models, I think the role of corporations can be interestingly a little more limited, but definitely Peter can chime in and share more.
Yeah, so I would like to also add to that. So because queer activism, emerged since 1990s and worked closely with feminist and women's rights groups in Taiwan. So since the very beginning, when Taiwan turned to democratization, the journey has always been close with the gender equality and sexual rights movements. So I think Taiwan is a pretty exceptional case, among other Asian countries. For example, I understand that in many South Asian countries, they rely on the embassy model very much because they somehow require the international political pressure to leverage for the rights agendas in their activism work. But that's not really the case in Taiwan. So Taiwan becomes a very interesting contrast compared to other Southeast Asian countries.
So Taiwan launched its inaugural LGBT Pride in 2003. It was the first such event in the Chinese-speaking world, and it started with funding from the government and grassroots donations. But over the years grew to be Asia's biggest, with multinational sponsorship from big tech like Google, Micron, and pharmaceutical companies like Gilead and AstraZeneca. Last year, 90% of its funding came from corporate donations or collaborations. But organizers this year told us their corporate financial support has dropped. Here's Meng-Chun's son. He's the Director of Business Collaboration at the Taiwan Rainbow Civil Action Association. It is the NGO which largely organizes the Taiwan Pride.
今年真的因为可能在美国的状况比较紧张，那美国总部那边也会去关注说，就是其他各个地方的投入情形。所以呢，就在今年的时候就说，他们今年没有办法持续的参加。就是近期也有相关的企业，因为可能我们已经谈好我们的合作，然后走到合约，那中间就说他们没有办法持续参与了。那虽然没有明讲，但我们猜也是可能类似的理由。但我们今年呢，很幸运的就是有台湾指标性的企业，像 TSMC 他们在今年呢第一次参与赞助台湾同志游行，所以在未来我们也有一个期待是，当然就是在外国企业可能没有那么多的状况下，会有更多的台湾本土企业愿意去做台湾同志游行的投入。
To watch the full version of our feature on the impact of corporate involvement in Taiwan Pride, visit our YouTube channel or the Taiwan Plus website. Now, Pohan, as San mentioned there, many big U.S. companies scaled back their involvement and support for the LGBTQ community after Trump's re-election. Can you tell us what ripple effects we've seen, particularly here in Taiwan?
Yeah, I think under the current Trump administration, many corporates, not just corporates, but as far as I know, even the U.S. But the diplomats, they are not as outspoken as before for LGBT rights in Taiwan. So apparently the political pressure is on these international sponsors. But we can also see there is a trend where local business try to chip in and then try to be part of the activism strategy. Although, as I just mentioned as well, that these creative industries or this small business, they may not hold similar economic power compared to these international corporations. So as far as I know, many local activist groups, they are now also relying on private donors, but normally they are like not really big amount of money as well. So I think this ripple effect is actually more influential than we thought. At the same time, the U.S. retreat or the U.S. corporations retreat have reshaped the funding far beyond Pride. Many activism agendas have been working with these larger corporations to sponsor their activism items or initiatives, but now they also lose those funding support, which have been a difficult time for Taiwanese or other Asian LGBTQ organizations.
Right, hold that thought there, because we also spoke to Hao-Zhong, a researcher and journalist focusing on queer politics and social movements, to get insight on how Taiwan Pride evolved. And he had some interesting thoughts. Take a listen.
因为2013年台湾的那个当时伴侣盟推出三法的这个3套法案的这个运动嘛，所以后来所谓的家庭权或成婚权，我觉得某种程度上成为同志运动的一个主轴。那尽管这个时期在接下来的几年当中，同志游行曾经提出不同的诉求，不过那个时候同婚我觉得在社会上已经成为一个主要被讨论的话题。然后一直到2019年确定以这个非民法一个特别法的方式通过了同性婚姻。我觉得在那之后的转折，就是因为一个最大的诉求达成了，所以就是坦白讲，近年来我都觉得同志游行的诉求越来越抽象，就是它变得作文非常漂亮，但是其实不太确定它很明确到底要表达或者他想要号召召唤怎么样的人群。
Minwoo, why do some in the community, like we heard Wang there, feel that brand activism can dilute the movement's political or radical edge? And what's your take?
That's a great point, and that has been a criticism widely circulated within the activist communities, right, including Taiwanese activist community. And then I believe that many activists are aware of that, but then I think the material conditions of many activist groups and civil society organizations are still dire. And then I think the particular challenge for a lot of East Asian economies is that East Asian economies are considered as highly developed, right? It is true that in terms of GDP and the gross income of these countries, it's highly rich countries compared to many other countries, right? So many of the organizations, NGOs, and civil society organizations in these countries, including Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, they're not eligible for a lot of global funding schemes from US aid or EU funding or other US-based fundings, right? But at the same time, they're not the most supportive environment, especially when they cater for more marginalized communities, right? Even within the LGBT community, if you deal with, issues of sex workers or chemsex issues or people living with disabilities, they won't get funded for whatever initiative that you have. So in facing these challenging financial circumstances, they still have to find, and rely on certain funding sources. And that, as Peter mentioned earlier, are just a handful number of options, including some private donors or small foundations. Some of them American, some of them are Dutch, some of them are European, elsewhere, and some of them are these, U.S. government-sponsored foundations and funding sources. So that it's the material conditions that necessitates a lot of activists in Asia and beyond to search for these fundings, which can be actually problematic because these funding sources can shape the trajectories and the agenda settings and prioritization of the activism overall. So I think it's important to strike the right balance between how, you find your resources, but at the same time, how you can keep your autonomy. And I think if you rely 100% on certain funding sources, and then you may not have the your own voice to pursue your initiatives and goals. But if you can find the right balance, then maybe you are able to find, your own voice in this dire situation.
I would like to also echo what Minwoo just mentioned. So, I mean, that's a long-standing critique from working class or trans activists, where visibility and respectability often replace the much-needed attention to structural and social injustice issues. So, I probably want to provide more context in terms of so-called pink economy in Taiwan. So in the 1990s, we used to have a lot of queer bars, bookstores, saunas. They were lifelines. They were spaces for survival and community more than consumption. So that was more like a necessity for the community building. But then came the internet. The queerness turned into algorithm, apps, social media that pushed the platform and attention economy to focus on brand building in terms of visibility and profit. And I think that's where pink economy started to shape queer community or queer activism agenda very much. So today, the story is even transnational, right? So pink economy travels. Gay men fly to Songkran in Bangkok or Ageha parties in Tokyo. Others join Pride in Taipei, for example. A lot of people coming from different Asian countries around the world to Taipei just for the Pride, or Pink Dot Singapore. So where many gay and lesbian couples travel elsewhere for surrogacy and IVF. So you can see how this corporate power started to be really closely linked to LGBT social inclusion and economic inclusion. But these circuits linked leisure, pleasure, technological development, and reproduction all together, but they also expose deep inequalities over whom can afford a mobility, who holds the passport, or whose bodies are commodified. So I think in Taiwan, so a very interesting example in Taiwan was that we used to have an organization called Poor 同志 Political Participation Group, 贫穷同志参政团, which was formed around 2010s. They were aiming to link issues of sexual justice and social justice, but they haven't been very successful, influential during the heydays for marriage equality campaign. So, as the video just showed to us, during the marriage equality campaign time, that was when most LGBTQ members tried to prove they deserve social and legal inclusion for being as a productive member, a contributing member to the capitalist society. And I think that's where the radical power of queer activism slightly faded away around that time. So I think this is also the time when we reflect on this piece of history and to think whether, how can we carry on the radical and the political power of queer activism beyond marriage equality.